Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think it's finally happening. I feel like right now Sony is kind of on their back foot when it comes to the Activision Blizzard acquisition by Microsoft. Of course, this has been going on since January of last year, but recently a lot has sort of been happening because we are getting closer and closer to that expected month for this entire thing to close, that being June. At least that's the estimation Microsoft gave a while ago now. But Sony is starting to say some weird things that has me thinking they're kind of spinning around a bit, and maybe we'll have to take that 10-year deal because as we've gone along, they've kind of been left almost on an island as the opposition against the deal going through. And we're going to take a look at some of the latest back and forth here today. So if you guys enjoy the video, make sure you like it and subscribe if you're new here to the Spawnwave Plus channel. Let's head over here, though, to the Verge. It's based on some new information that's come out from the UK, the regulator there, talking about Sony and, again, back and forth between Microsoft and Sony, with Microsoft attempting to really appease regulators to try to get the deal approved and through. And really, I feel like as soon as one of the larger regulators approves it, the other regulators will probably most likely look at that and say, okay, well, we'll maybe get this moving along too. So that's kind of why I think right now we're going to start to see this accelerate going towards June, as there's already been reports that in the EU is most likely going to be approving this deal here soon. But this is Sony's latest argument, and there's some funny stuff to consider, really. But Sony is worried that Microsoft will sabotage Call of Duty for the PlayStation. Okay, so the idea here is the deal goes through. Microsoft, of course, would be in charge of Activision because they would own them, who would be developing Call of Duty. And Microsoft is promising a lot in terms of where Call of Duty will be available, even going as far as to say there will be a version of Call of Duty on the Switch. And they had some more stuff to talk about that, but we'll cover that a bit more in Newswave tomorrow, so make sure you check that out, 8 a.m. Eastern Time tomorrow. But let's take a look here. This was cut up. I think this is Tom Warren, who, yes, it's from Tom Warren, but we can see the documentation here from the latest set of paperwork, and some of the stuff was redacted. Again, we'll talk about that, but Microsoft might release a PlayStation version of Call of Duty where bugs and errors emerge only on the game's final level or after later updates. This is from Sony in response to Microsoft, who has kept saying that they will keep the version of Call of Duty on PlayStation in parity with Microsoft in terms of content, releases, etc. They say even if such degradations could be swiftly detected, any remedy would likely come too late, by which time the gaming community would have lost confidence in PlayStation as a go-to venue to play Call of Duty. Indeed, as Modern Warfare 2 attests, Call of Duty is most often purchased in just the first few weeks of release, which that's common for basically any game, as you see them show up on sales charts, with the most transparent one being in Japan. But even in like the UK, where you have the numbered placements, we always hear about a 60% drop off from just the first to the second week, and then we see these releases tend to peter out, fall out of the top 10 and kind of kick around in there, and then maybe even fall further out of the top 20. Occasionally you have those evergreen titles that just don't make any sense, like Mario Kart 8 Deluxe or Grand Theft Auto 5. But it's more common than not to see these games kind of just slowly fall off over time, with the majority of their stuff selling immediately right out of the gate. Says if it became known that the game's performance on PlayStation was worse than on Xbox, Call of Duty gamers could decide to switch to Xbox for fear of playing their favorite game at a second-class or less competitive venue. So it's interesting. I saw some people on Twitter, other social media, say, how would Sony come up with this hypothetically? Since there has been speculation, and to my knowledge, I've never seen any definitive proof that Sony has actually done this. Just the end result of games just running better on the PS5 than the Xbox. And that has been something consistently happening, to the point where when I was on the Xbox 2+1 podcast the other week, which was a fun show, that was a topic that was discussed. Like, why is this happening? Where Xbox, which on paper is more powerful than the PS5, specifically when it comes down to teraflops and all of this, but for some reason, these games keep running better, and we hear about the marketing deals in place with some of those games. But even Atomic Heart, which was, I mean, we saw Microsoft do the entire Game Pass deal with them and handle some of the marketing, ran better on the PlayStation. And, you know, it is hard to say because well, I'm not a developer using those tools, but that is something that's been brought up. The tool set available, SDKs, those sorts of things that help to optimize, and of course, just the overall developer workflow could more or less favor Sony with what they have provided compared to Microsoft with their 2 SKU approach, Xbox Series S and Xbox Series X. But in essence, Sony is saying that Microsoft would purposely sabotage Call of Duty on the PlayStation and have gamers go over to the better running version on the Xbox. Because I will tell you, with a game like Call of Duty, performance is key, and you don't want frame drops all over the place when you're doing multiplayer. They even turn down the visual fidelity in multiplayer to ensure that you have a more or less locked frame rate, especially because it is considered, more competitive style and all of those sorts of things. So if you're on PlayStation and this thing's dropping frames all over the place, you're going to look for a better option. And if you're not going to PC, I guess you're going to Xbox. They do bring up the idea, though, that this could be something that would play into the marketing, like plays best on Xbox, which, again, Microsoft is going to push the marketing heavily whenever they do acquire Activision Blizzard. At this point, I think it's kind of inevitable now. And what we're seeing from Sony is just them more or less posturing for negotiation's sake when it comes to the deal that they inevitably sign with Microsoft. A stipulation could be that you can't purposely sabotage Call of Duty for the Xbox versus PlayStation or any of that. And that'll be left up to interpretation, because they could just say, hey, we're trying to hit 120 FPS on both systems, and the Xbox can just maybe handle it a bit better with their current SDK or anything there, right? So I think it's more or less going to be, it can't be horrible in terms of optimization all of a sudden overnight with the next release. You have to do your best to keep it within reason for overall performance parity. Now, the other part of this does bring up the idea of Game Pass, and I still think that is something that Sony is very concerned about. The idea of Call of Duty going into Game Pass without them getting a fair shot to add Call of Duty into their own subscription service. Here's the problem, though, and it's something I thought about immediately. Sony's not getting Call of Duty in their PlayStation Plus premium or extra subscription fee for free. It's not going to just appear and Microsoft's going to give it to them. There would be negotiating going on for that as well. And the way I understand it, how this would work, there's like an estimated amount of copies you would expect to sell as a publisher. And when Microsoft would approach you about your game going to Game Pass, or you approach them, you have a number in mind, and then you guys kind of go back and forth and come up with an amount that would essentially cover that, because you figure a lot of people are going to opt to download it through Game Pass rather than outright buy it as they would without that entry into Game Pass. And how many copies of Call of Duty do you think sell on PlayStation? Well, I can tell you it's a lot. If Call of Duty is selling anywhere from 20 to 25 million, which is a pretty consistent figure even for some of the less interesting entries, something like Call of Duty Vanguard, you think half of those are selling on PlayStation? Maybe more than half? That's between PlayStation, Xbox, and PC. Is Sony going to be able to cover 10 million copies? Because here, they say it wouldn't make any sense at all. In fact, the quote is, they say, would commercially destroy Sony Interactive Entertainment's SIE multi-game subscription business model, because it would just cost way too much. And I think those are the two big factors at play right now and why Sony is fighting this so hard. One, they're trying to negotiate clearly, but the big thing here would be the marketing that Microsoft will absolutely take advantage of. And two, it's going to come down to the situation around Game Pass getting some of these big titles, because while we are talking about Call of Duty, Diablo 4 would go right into it. So you're also considering things coming out of Blizzard as well as Activision. But Call of Duty is something that Sony is not going to front the money for to get into their service. And they're concerned if Game Pass has it, people will switch from PlayStation to Xbox. And that's something I completely understand. I think most of us do. Even though Microsoft is trying to downplay that idea, it's hard to argue with the value there if Call of Duty is going into a $15 a month, like the Game Pass Ultimate subscription service every year. And then you also have all of the older Call of Duties in there immediately. Like, that library grows considerably, I mean, almost overnight, or probably a month or two because they'll have to get stuff set up for Game Pass and all the things in the back end. But consider all the Activision Blizzard stuff that would just show up in Game Pass, and it just makes that value proposition for the consumer even better and even harder to believe when you really look at it. But to me, this is just Call of Duty being the big thing that's focused on right now, and Sony doing everything they can to posture and negotiate for a deal that inevitably is going to go through and then want to get something signed and conceded to them from Microsoft. But let me know what you guys think about this one down below, especially the idea of Xbox sabotaging Sony's version of the game. Do you think Sony knows this from experience, as people were bringing up, or are they just kind of pulling a hypothetical out as a just in case? So thanks guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.